Joining me now to discuss this further from New York is senior foreign policy writer at Newsweek, Tom O'Connor. Tom, good to have you here with us on TRT World. Now, we have been talking about this for months now. Tell me, where do we think we currently stand in terms of the crisis in eastern Ukraine?
Sure. Well, I think that there's been a lot of focus on the Normandy format and the talks that have accompanied it. There was some hope a couple weeks back with the Paris talks, and now obviously disappointment in Berlin. But I think that this is a format that's destined to fail if there's not a greater effort to address the difference, the gap between Russia and the West when it comes to the Eastern European security order. Obviously, this is the bigger Russian concern, and I think that the Ukraine, the talks specifically around the Ukraine situation are somewhat of a distraction, because I think that obviously all parties in principle agreed to the Minsk agreements and the protocols associated with it. But right now, obviously, the more pressing issue in the Kremlin's mind are these national security assurances and guarantees they want from NATO. And until there's some sort of diplomacy successes in that category, I'm not sure that there's any room to be hopeful in the sense of how this will go.
Now, Tom, U.S. President Joe Biden has urged American nationals to leave Ukraine immediately. Now, earlier, he asked embassy staff to leave Ukraine. Now, do you think this is a possible indication that a threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine is now more serious than ever before?
It's been clear to me that in the past few weeks, the Biden administration has certainly amplified its messaging when it comes to the potential imminent Russian attack. We've seen intel declassified regarding a potential false flag operation. We've also seen the Russians today accuse Ukraine of potentially plotting a false flag operation within its own soil against Russian ethnic Russians in Ukraine, rather. And I think that right now this sort of messaging is somewhat trying to ensure that the U.S. is not caught off guard. I'm not sure that there has been any indications that any operations are more imminent than before. But I think one thing that was interesting was the British Prime Minister had mentioned and used the term edge of a precipice in reference to the situation in Europe right now. That's the exact same term that the Russian ambassador had used last month when I spoke with him. And I think that right now that's a good way to describe the situation, that the drums of war are beating. And even if Russia says that it's not planning to engage in any military operation, it is saying it's willing to defend its territory. And of course, we know that there's always competing narratives as to what really starts a conflict. But at the end of the day, when the conflict starts, it's very difficult to get out of it.
Now, Tom, the United States and Ukraine may be allies, but they certainly do not agree on whether or not a Russian invasion of Ukraine is imminent. Tell me, why do you think Kiev keeps downplaying U.S.'s warnings about a potential Russian invasion?
Well, first off, I think it's important to note that U.S. and Ukraine are not actual treaty allies, and I think that's a key part of this. They are partners in many ways, but they are not an ally, and that's why the U.S. has been hesitant to commit any actual troops, because they're not part of the NATO alliance. And of course, Russia does not want them to be part of the NATO alliance. That is part of the trigger of this crisis. At the same time, I think that we've spoken to U.S. officials, we've spoken to Russian officials, and we've spoken to many Ukrainian officials and former officials, of course. And there's a bit of a suspicion within Kiev that the U.S. is amplifying this sort of rhetoric on purpose in order to sort of deter Russia to preempt any sort of action that may or may not happen. That's a feeling in Kiev right now. At the same time, in the U.S., the feeling is that Ukraine is downplaying this sort of threat that's around it for economic reasons, for social stability reasons, of course. If you're in a country that's on the brink of war, obviously things can go downhill before the conflict even starts. And I think that President Zelensky is trying to downplay that right now.
All right, Tom O'Connor in New York. Tom, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.